Frank is no longer Professor of Political Economy, but the Emeritus Professor. But without further ado, I'll invite him to address the topic.
Thanks very much. Indeed, it is a pleasure to come and meet and interact with you today. And my role, as Victor has emphasised, is to inject an economic dimension into our discussions. This may not sound terribly appetising, but you've all had a nice lunch. You're all well aware of the importance of the material conditions of our existence. And I want to explore those themes a little further. Historically, the Enlightenment provided an important break in thinking about the human condition and the possibilities of progress. This is certainly evident in the most important of the Enlightenment thinkers from a political economic perspective, Adam Smith, and much of my remarks will be about Smith's contribution. But I also want to make reference to Karl Marx, to Henry George, to John Maynard Keynes, to John Kenneth Galbraith, important figures over the last 200 years, all of whom can be seen to have bounced off the Enlightenment springboard. All concerned with understanding the forces shaping our material conditions and fashioning institutions that will help to improve those conditions. The era of the Enlightenment paved the way. But in modern society, I'm going to argue, the key issues are not easily resolved by reference to the principles of the Enlightenment. Indeed, those principles can be marshalled in support of deeply contradictory positions, some of which are individualistic, market-oriented, others of which are collective, more concerned with social planning and with institution building. Now, this is not surprising, I think, in the realm of economic discourse, because, broadly speaking, the environment can be, the Enlightenment can be said to have paved the way for two great rival traditions of political thought, liberalism and socialism. Both have in common a humanist basis, a belief in self-directed activity that can create the conditions for social progress. In other words, using reason and science, for that matter, more generally, as means of shaping economic and social progress. So, because both small L liberals and socialists can claim to be the disciples of the great Enlightenment thinkers, we have, I think, no clear guidelines in addressing current economic problems, of economic insecurity, of inequality, of conflicts with the physical environment. And in part, you might say that's because of the debasement of those great traditions of liberalism and socialism. Liberalism becoming largely debased into its current form as neoliberalism, a modern ideology of the corporate capitalist class. And socialism being debased through 20th century experiments with the development of command administrative economies, in the extreme, debased in the form of Stalinism. In other words, leading to regimes that are the antithesis of respect for individual freedom, social justice and human progress. We've got to rethink this whole situation. But the tensions were evident right from the start in the work of Adam Smith, who I've earlier described as the greatest of the Enlightenment thinkers from a political economic perspective. Now, Smith is best known for his book The Wealth of Nations, published originally in 1776. Few people read it these days, but it unquestionably has had a major influence on all subsequent economic thought. Put rather simply, Smith can be regarded as the proponent of individual initiative as the driver of economic progress. On his reasoning, the invisible hand of the market, and I pause there to note that that phrase, so commonly associated with Smith, appeared only once in his book, The Wealth of Nations, and almost as a passing reference. But the invisible hand of the market is a phrase that seems to encapsulate Smith's notion that individuals pursuing their own economic self-interest would be guided as if by an invisible hand to produce outcomes that are good for the society as a whole. There's a famous phrase that almost everyone quotes, and if I can put on my best Scottish accent, it goes roughly like this. It's not from the benevolence of the butcher or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. Look, we don't know how Adam Smith spoke, of course. There are no tape recordings, so one can only surmise that he spoke somewhat in those terms, although that probably sounds more like a minor character in The Bill or Taggart or one of those modern Glaswegian dramas. This emphasis, though, on individual self-interest as the driver of economic progress contrasted with the prevailing ideas at the time, which emphasised the role of the sovereign in creating social order and arguably the Christian corporate ethic in providing the legitimacy for that then set of economic, social and political arrangements. Smith was on the side of the progressives during the transition from feudalism to capitalism. He thought that the breaking down of the old order under the rule of the monarch and legitimised by the Christian corporate ethic would be a good thing. Not that Smith was opposed to Christianity, but that he thought that the Christian corporate ethic was excessively paternalistic in character. And indeed it was very paternalistic. This was the era in which the relatively well-to-do members of society felt they had an obligation for the welfare of the less well-to-do. There was a common phrase at the time, which is roughly along the lines, "The rich man, if he doth not give alms, is but a thief." In other words, the social responsibility of the wealthy to be charitable and kindly towards the less fortunate. That was what I call, broadly speaking, the Christian corporate ethic. Now, also at that time was a belief that traders should trade at a just price. Now, quite what constitutes a just price is debatable, but here is the notion that a price is not just a price, it has to be a just price. In other words, something that embodies an ethical relationship between buyer and seller. Now, to cut a long story rather short, Smith swept this lot away and said, no, if everyone in the market just pursues their own self-interest, that will lead to the production of the goods and services that are in demand by the consumers, and all will benefit. Moreover, in the realm of industry and production, it will unleash the forces of the division of labour, increasingly specialised tasks being undertaken by the workers, raising the overall level of productivity, producing more goods and services, and then with the growth of trade, both within and between nations, international exchange would occur to the benefit of all. It was a marvellous vision that Smith advanced, and indeed it was taken up enthusiastically by the emerging capitalist class, because it provided a legitimacy for the emerging arrangements of a capitalist economy. It was, in other words, a new ideology for a new political economic system. And to this day, some economists still repeat essentially the same dogma that I've just summarised. The Smithian analysis is carried on in the textbooks, not typically by reference to Adam Smith, but in the form of economic principles which emphasise the market as the main engine for efficiency and economic growth. These days, people don't talk about these things in terms of moral philosophy, but in terms of formal mathematics and econometric modelling. But underlying assumptions are those which can be seen to have derived from Smith's view of self-interest as the driver of progress. Milton Friedman, for example, a very influential economist of the last half century, some would say the most influential economist of the last half century, arguably founding not just monetarism, but also a broader neoliberal program embraced by Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, other major political figures of the last half century, and creating substantial transformation. Would Smith have approved? I don't think so. If you look carefully at Smith's work, you'll see that he was not an apologist for free market capitalism in all respects. He didn't trust capitalists. Another common quotation from Smith, but I'll spare you the Glaswegian accent. Roughly in the following words, that when businessmen of the same trade meet together, the conversation normally turns to some conspiracy against the public interest or a contrivance to raise prices. In other words, he thought that the self-interest of capitalists would lead them to collusive behaviour that is against the public interest. Smith was in favour of competitive markets, not in favour of capitalist acquisition. He thought competitive markets were the means by which you would keep these collusive and antisocial behaviours in check. I don't think he would much have approved of a modern corporate economy with huge multinational giants colluding together to serve their collective interests. Smith was an advocate of the division of labour too, as I've just pointed out, but he had mixed feelings about it. There's another phrase in his book, The Wealth of Nations, where he says that increasingly specialised tasks in industry lead people to become, quote, as stupid and ignorant as a person can possibly become. In other words, he saw that there was at least the prospect, if not the likelihood, of alienation being the consequence of this increasingly complex capitalist economic system. He also thought that social bonds were a precondition for effective markets. The other book that he wrote was called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, written before The Wealth of Nations, and he, in that, emphasised very strongly what we would now call the importance of social capital, of trust, of social relations, of empathy, of altruism, as preconditions for the functioning of an efficient and progressive economic system. And returning to that question of the sovereign, well, yes, Smith thought that it was important to roll back, to some extent, the role of the state, as we would now call it, but not in all respects. He thought the state was very important for the provision of public goods. Might have felt somewhat sceptical about current proposals for privatisation of some industries. He was also a strong advocate of the state as the guardian of collective interests by restricting people's behaviours in ways that would lead to unjust outcomes. He thought all these were very important functions for the state, as we would now call it. In summary, the ideas that Smith developed are contested terrain. There are right-wing and left-wing Adam Smiths to be found, depending upon your selective mining of the original territory. And indeed, the whole field of political economy, ever since Smith, has been contested terrain. My textbook for undergraduate students is entitled Political Economy, the Contest of Economic Ideas. There is no, or should be, no accepted orthodoxy. This is a field of debate in which we can use reason, marshal evidence, in the hope of, through contesting propositions, make some increased understanding of the economy in which we live and some guidelines for improving it. Karl Marx addressed the issues in a quite different way to Smith, putting the emphasis more on class than on individual behaviours, emphasising the possibilities of revolutionary rupture as economic systems change from capitalism to socialism, as they had done previously with systems of slavery and feudalism. In other words, major epoch-making shifts that are an important and an integral part in the process of economic progress. He thought capitalism was a progressive system. In this respect, agreed with Smith that it was a progressive system relative to what had gone before, but he thought it only play a stage in human progress, giving way, indeed, under the weight of its own contradictions, of exploitation, of inequality, periodic economic crisis, and thence to a system which is more egalitarian, more stable, more planned. We wait. Henry George, also following in the footsteps of Adam Smith, had strong prescriptions about changing direction. Like Smith, Henry George thought that individual freedom of the marketplace was very important, but that he thought there was one huge flaw in the system which enabled landowners to capture the lion's share of the fruits of economic progress without making any personal effort to do so. In other words, they became a parasitic class and thereby constituted a fetter on social progress. A problem which, according to George and his advocates to this day, could be easily resolved through one major social reform: a uniform and substantial land tax, to ensure that the revenues created by economic progress don't go to landowners but go to the state, where they can be used for public purposes, financing better schools, roads, education, or whatever. John Maynard Keynes, similarly following in the footsteps of the Enlightenment thinkers like Adam Smith, but again emphasising that capitalism has a fundamental flaw. Not the flaw that Henry George emphasised, but the flaw of recession and unemployment. Because Keynes, writing at the time of the Great Depression in the 1930s, observed that capitalism is not a stable system, or if it is system stabilising, it's not at full employment. And if, as a society, we think that unemployment is a scourge, creating tremendous social stress for individuals and for whole societies, then it's incumbent upon us to modify the economic system in ways that redress those problems. The famous Keynesian prescriptions, of course, focused on the role of fiscal and monetary policies as tools that governments can use for macroeconomic stabilisation, ensuring that we don't remain vulnerable to periodic recession. And indeed, following the Second World War, those prescriptions were followed to a considerable extent in Australia, as in most capitalist countries, and contributed in part to the long period of full employment right through from the Second World War into the 1970s. And it was in that era that John Kenneth Galbraith wanted to push the arguments yet further. Galbraith, a Keynesian, but arguing that governments shouldn't restrict themselves to monetary and fiscal policies to stabilise the economy. Government should also be involved in major income redistribution, anti-poverty programs, major extensions in the provision of public goods to overcome what he called the social imbalance between private wealth and public squalor. In other words, dealing with the fundamental flaw that he saw in capitalism of its tendency to facilitate individual enrichment, but at the expense or the neglect of collective social needs. This is a formidable legacy of political economic ideas, from Smith through the late 19th century, Henry George, Karl Marx in the same century, on to Keynes, Galbraith, and many others, of course, in the 20th century. These are ideas that all have their roots in basic Enlightenment ideals. They all have in common a belief that we can use our analysis, our rationality in understanding the world so that we can change it for the better. So belief, optimism, confidence in purposive social action, collective action as well as individual action, are the hallmarks of this great legacy of political economic ideas following the pioneering work of Adam Smith. And the action, as I've already indicated, may take many forms. Government taxes and expenditures, or fiscal policy. Monetary policy through adjustment of the money supply, prevailing rate of interest. Trade policy between nations. Public investment policies, industry policies, policies that bear on the relationship between the economy and the environment. There is no limit to the array of ameliorative measures that could be implemented to reconcile the self-interest in economic affairs with the broader collective interest with which all these political economists have been concerned. But if you look at the situation today, it's actually rather difficult to maintain the confidence that we're on track for further progress. Isn't it? It is difficult. This is a huge, impressive legacy of political economic ideas, but where has it got us? We certainly have achieved affluence for a broad swathe of the society in countries like Australia, far beyond what Adam Smith could have anticipated. But we remain bedevilled by three major problems, to my mind. One is economic insecurity, most obviously in our mind because of the recent global financial crash. A recognition that capitalism, though it's capable of producing a cornucopia of products, is fundamentally an unstable system. Vulnerable, some would say increasingly vulnerable to periodic crises, which constitute a fundamental irrationality. Because why should people lose jobs? Why should they lose incomes? Why should they have their retirement savings undermined through no fault of their own because of some systemic collapse driven by behaviour of others in speculative markets? Is that a rational way to organise providing for the material conditions of our existence? Hardly. And what of social inequality, the second major issue? Yes, societies as a whole, looking back over the last couple of centuries, have got much wealthier. Not all equally wealthy, and within nations, of course, inequalities have tended to increase. Certainly in the last half-century, during the period in which neoliberal ideas have become dominant, inequalities have increased markedly, particularly at the top end. It's not in general that the poor are getting poorer, but the rich are getting phenomenally richer. The so-called top 1% has increased its share of incomes and wealth most markedly. And there's a lot of evidence that unequal societies are deeply problematic societies. In other words, there's a strong correlation between the extent of economic inequality and the intensity of a wide array of social problems. Ill health, both physical and mental, problems of violence, of prison incarceration, even unwanted teenage pregnancies, all correlate quite strongly internationally with the level of inequality in different nations. And most fundamentally, harking back to Bentham and the greatest happiness for the greatest number, there's strong evidence that unequal societies tend to be unhappier societies, based on survey evidence. So, along with economic insecurity, economic inequality seems to be a problem that's getting worse, not better. And then there's the big one, the relationship between the economy and nature. The problem of economic unsustainability is much in our minds, not just because of climate change and its awful prospect, but because of a whole array of other environmental problems. Toxicity, despoilation of waterways, loss of arable land, an ecological footprint that already, by some estimates, exceeds the planet. How to deal with that major stress remains unresolved, even with this great legacy of political economic thought. So I think that's the challenge facing us today. So the message I'm presenting is twofold. On the one hand, it involves respect for a great tradition of political economic thought that has developed post-Adam Smith, bouncing off the springboard of Enlightenment ideas. We'll never go back. We wouldn't want to go back as a society. This is the great bounce forward, but it's only taken us so far. And in the modern era, it seems that it's not enough to take us the next step. So I would argue, in relation to the political economic challenges that face us now, we need, in effect, a new Enlightenment, and one that will put ecological issues right at the core of the new way of thinking. That's not at the expense of concerns about security and inequality. I think a combination of economic ideas that focus on sustainability, on social justice, on fairness, is the way forward. But it's hard to see this at the moment becoming the dominant orthodoxy in a period where neoliberal beliefs, with their dubious association with environment, with the Enlightenment, are apparently paramount. And if you don't need any further evidence to support that argument, I simply refer you to the federal budget.